Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Hello and welcome to this midweek edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show tonight...
This is not an austerity budget. It is a budget that makes tough trade-offs in the interest of the country's short and long-term prosperity.
The numbers have been crunched, allocations have been made, but is Enoch Godongwana's budget as pro-poor as he claims it is? We go behind and beyond the numbers, things the finance minister said and didn't say, to try and see whether indeed the budget table today speaks to the plight of the needy. The Watchdog starts now. Now, before we bring you representatives of civil society formations for a roundtable discussion to reflect on what Budget 2023 is telling us about what the government thinks of the poor, here are some of the highlights of this budget. The focus of the 2023 budget is the crippling electricity crisis and Eskom's high debt that is affecting overall economic performance. Government plans to offload 254 billion rands of Eskom's debt to enable the troubled power utility to carry on with investment and maintenance. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana presented the budget amidst unfavorable economic conditions characterized by the low growth that is exacerbated by those power failures, but also deteriorating rail and port infrastructure, high inflation, as well as a weaker global outlook.
Growth is expected to slow to 0.9% this year as the country battles infrastructure constraints and poor domestic and global environment. Government acknowledges this level of growth is below the pace required to generate significant employment growth and support national development. The slow implementation of structural reforms could lower business confidence and deter new investments. Government spending exceeds revenue. Public debt remains high. Debt servicing costs continue to rise. Government says risks to the fiscal outlook include the low growth leading to lower tax revenue, rising borrowing costs, and unaffordable public service wage bill settlements. But it says it remains committed to stabilizing public debt and ensuring sustainable public finances.
Government must maintain a prudent fiscal stance. The fiscal consolidation strategy we adopted several years ago has, one, restrained growth mainly in consumption expenditure, and two, allowed us to use part of higher than expected revenues to reduce the deficit. As a result, we're bringing the fiscal deficit down without resorting to tax increases or further cuts in social wage and infrastructure.
Learning and culture, comprised of education and associated sectors, received the biggest slice of government spending, followed by social development, which covers different social grants. Debt servicing costs crowd spending with an allocation of 340 billion rand, which translates to 8 cents of every 1 rand of revenue collected going towards servicing debt. Community development, covering human settlements and public transport, gets 260 billion rand, while health gets 259 billion rand and peace and security 227 billion rand. In its attempt to solve Eskom's debt and electricity supply crisis, the troubled power utility will get relief amounting to 254 billion rand over the next 3 years. Eskom's debt currently stands at 423 billion rand. Government guarantees 350 billion rand of this debt. This implies an increase in government debt. Economists say the goal of fiscal consolidation is still within reach.
It is achievable, and fortunately the Treasury budgeted for that to continue. Lower deficits over time, primary surplus. In other words, we no longer need to borrow to pay interest on our debt. That's a huge plus. And even with Eskom's addition of debt, the debt profile still stabilizes and it still comes off in future years.
Elle says rating agencies will likely welcome the budget and will wait until later in the year to review the country's ratings. The finance minister says South Africans should be prepared for the possibility of the country being grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force. South Africa was found lacking in terms of anti-money laundering and terrorism financing controls. The finance minister says while 2 laws have been enacted to address the deficiencies in the legislative framework, there are remaining deficiencies that do not require legislation. FATF is expected to make its decision on South Africa later this week. Gloria Safako Musi, SABC News, Parliament.
Government is increasing social grants to over 300 billion rands. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana presented this in Parliament this afternoon. Godongwana has dubbed his budget a non-austerity budget. He adds that this is a budget that makes tough trade-offs in the interests of the country's short and long-term prosperity.
Pensioners will soon get just a little over 2,000 rand by October this year. This as the old age and disability grants increases by 100 rand this year. Over the medium term, government allocated 66 billion rand to social development, while at the same time, 36 billion rand is also allocated to fund the extension of the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant until 31 March next year.
30 billion rand is used for inflation-linked increases for Ogogo. The old age and disability grant increases by 90 rand from the 1st of April. And a further 10 rand by the 1st of October. The result is a total increase to 2,090 by the end of October, what they will be earning. The child support grant rises from 480 to 510 from the 1st of October, while the foster care grant increases from 1,070 to 1,130 over the same period. 23 billion and 22 billion will be allocated to health and basic education, respectively, to cover the shortfall in compensation budgets and to improve services. 8 billion is allocated for basic services through the local government equitable share.
Opposition parties say the budget does not benefit those who need it most, the vulnerable.
The increased economic growth that was unexpected for last year, the increased tax collection revenue doesn't accrue to the people who need it most in this budget. The failure to increase the social relief of distress grant, as the President hinted would happen, is a massive failure of poor people in South Africa.
Meanwhile, government says social grants formed an important part of the budget.
Because the grants currently are needed while we are growing the economy and having to expand on making sure that people remain and continue to have something to eat on their table.
Government says it is increasing allocations to key frontline departments above existing baselines by moving towards a change in the composition of spending from consumption to investment, while maintaining a large social security safety net, while striving for sustainable levels of debt. Nothando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
After the break, civil society formations discuss whether the finance minister's budget speaks to the plight of the poor and most vulnerable. Amid the rising cost of living affecting all of us, a record high unemployment rate, extremely high levels of poverty and inequality, the government has a duty and an obligation to provide relief and assistance to the most vulnerable sections of the population who are least capable of doing so for themselves. But does today's budget speak to that? Well, for a focused conversation to try and answer that question, please welcome representatives of a range of civil society formations that have made it their job to ensure that not only do these conversations take place all the time, but that solutions are indeed found, difficult as that may be in certain instances. With me in studio is Nomza Mozondo, the Executive Director of the Social Economic Research Institute. Next to her is Gillard Isaacs from the Institute for Economic Justice. On the line from Cape Town, we have Rachel Bukasa, the Executive Director of the organization, the Black Sash. Also joining us online from Makanda in the Eastern Cape is Ayanda Kota from the organization Cry of the Excluded. Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Evening, thank you.
Gillard?
Thank you for having us.
Pro-poor budget or not?
No. I mean, the answer is no, in short. What the budget actually does is redistribute money from the poor to the wealthy. And how do I explain that? Well, the bottom 80% of income earners in South Africa are those which rely most on services. And those services have been cut, right? It's very easy in Parliament for the minister to stand up and go, 50 billion here and 100 billion there. What really matters is how this compares with inflation and with previous allocations, right? And what we see is a 1.2% average fall in real terms when you consider inflation over the medium term. That amounts to 86 billion rand less in expenditure than if we had just kept going in line with inflation. So some instances there, we see a fall in health expenditure by 4.9%. We see a fall in education by 2.4%. And we can unpack what that means in terms of learners and so on in a minute, right? The social release of stress grant allocations fall. So on the expenditure side, right, those relying on the public purse are receiving less. On the revenue side, what we actually see is the minister himself very positively wanting applause for the fact that there aren't tax increases, and in fact that there is a tax benefits in particular ways. Well, who pays tax? Only the top 20% in terms of income tax, not in terms of
company
VAT, right? So the services are falling, which service the bottom 80%, and the expenditure there is falling. On the other hand, the income taxpayers, who are the top 20%, are benefiting from various income tax relief. So that leaves us with a situation where, over the medium term, money is essentially flowing out of the hands of lower income people and the poor, and those benefiting are upper income earners and the super rich.
For you, Namzon?
I completely agree with Gillard. I think one of the best examples to look at is the issue around load shedding. The support that he has announced, he said in relation to businesses, they get 125% rebate on what they spend on solar and renewables. He says for those who can purchase solar for themselves, they get 25% rebate.
And we know the poor won't be able to do that.
The poor get zero. And it's devastating because we are currently living in a moment where there's hyperinflation. The load shedding is contributing towards that hyperinflation at the level of poor households. And what is said to us, despite the president last week having said there will be a solar rollout, he's basically said that rollout is only for those who have money, who are able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, which actually means not the poor. And that's just looking at the individual in the households. For us as SABC, for instance, we've been looking at municipalities and the crisis that is happening in municipalities and how there's crumbling infrastructure. And we look at this budget again, there's been another cut. There's only about a 2.8% increase towards municipalities, which means less money is available. So things will get worse. Those who are complaining in Durban, in Johannesburg about the state of the cities must expect things to become progressively worse in the next period.
Ayanda? Please unmute.
Thank you very much, Buyo. It's an austerity budget. It's a budget that is anti-poor. It doesn't speak to the more than 11 people that are unemployed in this country. What it does, it continues to lock them outside of the economic activities of this country. There's absolutely nothing about them. If you were even to look at the SRD, which last year was about 44 billion rand. And this current year, it's about 35.7 billion rand. So the 350, it's a nominal term. And the real term of that 350, the real term, it's just 280. If you consider what Gilead and Comrade Nomzamo talked about, the 7% food price inflation. So it's a budget that doesn't speak to the unemployed. It's a budget that leaves abantu abangaphangeliyo to fend for themselves. A government that says, we do not care for you. But also it's a budget, look at the 6% cut in terms of the health. And our healthcare system was exposed during the COVID. We did not have beds in our hospitals. We did not have enough hospitals. We did not have doctors. People were just dying, and the state of health in this country has not improved. To cut the health by 6% again, it's even worse. You are saying people, we are actually declaring that these hospitals are nothing but the deathbed for the poor and the unemployed in this country. The last point that I want to make is the point that Comrade Nomzamo makes about the state of these municipalities. The government is not committed in funding these municipalities. So the municipality in Makanda will continue to suffer. The municipality in Makanda will continue not to have money. We have financial recovery plan that was produced by the National Treasury. And we asked the question as the cry of the excluded and the unemployed people's movement to say, with this financial recovery plan, where do you expect this municipality to get the money? With this budget, throughout the country, the people in their township will continue to drive in potholes. I don't want to talk about ESCOM because you are in the load shedding. The crisis that is the ESCOM started with the corporatization of the ESCOM to say people and these municipalities must pay for electricity instead of government fully funding hospitals, instead of government instead of government fully funding ESCOM. So it's a budget that is anti-poor. It doesn't change the lives of the unemployed. It doesn't change the lives of the black working class. We are left to fend ourselves. In fact, we are living in the graveyards. We are left to die.
For you, Rachel?
Yeah, so I think for me, the fact that the minister's under the impression that this is a budget for the people, pro-poor budget, it really worries me because it shows a deep lack of understanding on what is happening on the ground. Because to be able to look at this budget and think that somehow you've done, something really good for the poor is really surprising on many levels. So as one of my colleagues was alluding to earlier, a lot of the big things is that it's easy to throw numbers around and sound impressive. So, for example, when the minister would say, 36 billion has been allocated this year for the SRD grant, well, actually, technically what that means is that it is 25% less than the 44 billion that was initially allocated, which means less people are going to be receiving the grants. So though impressive out of context, in context, the budget leaves a lot to be desired.
Gilad, I'm listening to commentators, economists throughout the day say the guy's hands are tied. You have an economy that is not performing. You have record high levels of unemployment, and the reason, for example, is they're stubbornly refusing to give workers to submit to the workers' wage demands. Is precisely because there isn't a lot of money to go around, and there won't be money to deal with the very same issues that these workers are raising. In other words, overworked nurses, shortages of teachers, and so on and so forth. Now, to be able to do that, he has to find money from somewhere.
Yeah, I think there's really two ways of answering that, right? The first is to say, well, at what level is our borrowing sustainable, right? That's the kind of boogeyman in the room, that we owe too much money. And over the last 3 years, we've seen a variety of estimates, which the National Treasury itself has said debt will stabilize at. In fact, the the number is higher now with the absorption of the ESCOM debt than it was 4 months ago, okay? So there's clearly not some magic kind of cut-off point where if you exceed 76 or 79, the sky's going to fall in, right? And that's clear from Treasury's own actions, right? So we need to decide then, right, so it's a myth that it has to reach this cut-off point, right? Of course, we don't want accelerating debt unmanageably, okay? And that brings us to the second answer, right? Which is, well, what's the relationship between government spending and increasing growth? Because if we do increase growth, not only will we solve some of the issues which you raised, but we'll also bring down debt levels, okay? Because debt levels are they're a percentage of growth, right? They're put forward as a share, 79% of GDP, for instance. And what, in the minister's mind and in the National Treasury approach, the public sector's the problem, not the solution, right? And that the way we stimulate growth is the public sector gets out the way, right? You hear that through the language of structural reforms, through the strong emphasis on PPPs, on unlocking private sector, and so on. Another and more appropriate view is to say that fiscal and policy and budget allocations can be growth enhancing. And if we do them right, and if we increase and spend in the appropriate areas, right, we're actually going to be able to secure increased growth and therefore secure sustainable debt levels. That's not the route which National Treasury opts for. National Treasury has opted for the route of slashing expenditure, which will be negative for economic growth. So we need to view the availability of funds in connection with the fact that there isn't some arbitrary cutoff. And in fact, if you spend wisely, you can widen that purse, not limit it.
But how much responsibility, I mean, the issue you're raising of municipalities that are going to receive less and less, and Ayanda was raising the very same issue. I mean, there are inefficiencies in the system. There's a lot of corruption. You know, these municipalities don't have the skills. They can't even account for the monies that they're giving. I'm not saying they should be punished for that, but could this not be an incentive for them to, you know, use this money more wisely for those controls, you know, I mean, to be there just so that, I mean, whatever, however little they may have should be used, I mean, wisely and optimally.
So interestingly, Minister Godongwana, in his speech last year, he spoke about that. He spoke about how over 170 municipalities are in financial distress. And his answer was, as Parliament and as national government will exercise oversight. So he knows that the responsibility lies with national government. The buck stops with them. And the reality is, unfortunately, they haven't exercised that oversight. And therefore, you say to municipalities, we'll give you less, so the poor get less, and miraculously, somehow, you will self-correct. The best way to get them to self-correct is to exercise your power as oversight in municipalities, in the Department of Local Government. But we have not seen that. We have not seen cooperative governance coming in to actually make sure that municipalities toe the line in terms of their spending, in terms of corruption, but also actually to say to us, here is a plan to overhaul the system. We have not had that. And it's really, I think it is quite damning to then just have them kind of just say, it's so bad, and therefore we'll give little. Actually, a much better thing is for them to exercise oversight. In fact, Ayanda will speak about where they have exercised that oversight. They've done it badly, firstly, but they actually have to be forced to exercise that oversight. So if national government was playing its role, even with those municipalities would be in a much different position.
Is that the view you hold as well, Ayanda, that Minister Godongwana shouldn't be washing his hands like the Pontius Pilate of the Bible? Please unmute.
Absolutely. Comrade Nomzamo is quite correct, because we are at the receiving end with the brand. The first person to hit you will be the local politician, because they've got their fingers at the tip. They want to thieve. So we are at the receiving end in that they are thieving from you. The second person to hit you is Godongwane by exercising austerity and say, we are not giving this municipality money. In fact, let me tell you, Vuyo, that these municipalities get just less than 9% of the total budget. It tells a point in Makanda. The revenue of this municipality is just over 700 million. You've got a decade infrastructure. And for you to be able to address a decade infrastructure, you need over 500 million. So for Godongwane to wash off his hands and to say, I'm innocent, I've got nothing to do, I'm not giving money, I'm not supporting these municipalities, the people that are at the receiving end are the poor and the unemployed, because we don't have any alternatives. So Godongwane is not innocent. He cannot claim to be innocent. As I'm saying, as the poor, as the unemployed, we are at the receiving end because of one, corruption, and because two, austerity measures of the likes of Godongwanas of this world. But again, and the question was, where is the money? Where must they get the money? I'm going to give you or provide you with a very lazy response to say, tax the rich. Pre-1994, the corporate tax in this country was just about 48%. When the government of national unity took over under this new dispensation, the corporate tax is just below 28%. So again, you are incentivizing the rich and punishing the poor. So I am saying the point that I'm making, through this budget, through corruption, the poor, the black working class is just punished all the way. The politicians that are thieving, the Godongwanas of this world are the fat cats who get punished, the poor and the unemployed, whether at the local municipality level or through the austerity budget of Godongwana. I don't want to say anything about women because they are the carriers of society. They bear the brunt. When the state of health collapses in this country, people who takes over the responsibilities of the state are women. They are carers at our homes. They are the carers of society. They are at the forefront of this receiving end. They bear the brunt. So it's a budget that doesn't speak to the poor. As I'm saying, Abangu Abagenando have been left in the graveyards to say, you just die. It's a shame.
Well, there's a view, Rachel, that, to tax this small pool, of people that you have, paying taxes would be shooting yourself. If the government did so, it would be shooting itself in the foot. And I'm saying this also in a week where we heard of a few executives who are being who have been poached, who have options to go abroad and leave the country. And I was listening to some of the arguments throughout the week when these issues were being discussed and debated. And people or countries like Canada, for example, are keen to absorb these skilled South Africans who studied at our universities, but now who are not going to get the opportunity to be able to, carry the country. And if you tax them to death, you're giving them more incentives to start looking abroad, or even on the continent for that matter, where their lives would be a lot better.
So you see, I think it's exactly what Comrade Ayanda was saying, that what he proposed was just, the lazy answer, as we say. We've said to government that there are other options on the table. Some of my comrades in this room, we've said to government, let's come together at the table have our different economists, have people who can, excuse me, test out ideas. There are different ways this can be afforded. And that taxing the rich, and in fact, when we speak about taxing the rich, and for example, the example you gave, Vuyo, about people leaving the country, being absorbed into other countries, we're all thinking about the same kind of people. And it's not the poor that we're thinking about who have those capabilities. So we have said to the government, there are different ways that this can be done. All we have asked is for them to come to the table, listen to the modeling, see how it gets modeled. They can have their own people. We can discuss this. We can yay and nay. But by not entertaining that conversation, it means that they are aware that it can be done, and then they simply do not want to entertain the conversation and carry on the way they do. And then to say that, no, taxing the rich is going to do X, Y, Z. Well, maybe what if we don't tax the rich? Let's start with managing money properly. Let's start with plugging the holes of corruption. Let's start with stopping the ever-sinking fund that is, for example, SAA and now ESCOM. And then let's start in re-looking at where money flows, as Gillard alluded to earlier. And
well, he says that's exactly why. He says that's exactly why it's giving money to the NPA, but also to Parliament, so that it can deal with the state capture, with the implementation of the state capture. Recommendation that state law enforcement agencies are able to enlist expertise that can then, run after these criminals.
Well, I mean, short of getting into trouble, but I think sometimes it's important that the criminals being chased are not, the people that are doing the chasing are not themselves involved in that. But the point that I'm making here is that there are other ways to do this. And we've said over and over again, let's sit down at a table, let these proposals be put forward. And by refusing to do that, what you do is that you confirm that there's no political will. This is not about money, because if there was political will to do this and look after the poor, there would be money. And suddenly you will see, come 2024, when it's near the election, suddenly these things will unplug some of it in order to get the people to vote. So for me, it's really hard to believe that the excuse here is the lack of funds.
Is the budget pro-poor? Well, that's the question we are asking this evening. And if it is not pro-poor, what then do we need to do? This conversation continues right after this short break. Welcome back. And if you've just joined us, we're looking at the budget that was tabled today by the finance minister. And the question we're asking on this show is whether it is as pro-poor as government officials have actually claimed that it is. Now, there was an expectation that the minister would say something about the basic income grant. The issue has been with us for a very long time. And at some point, I think late last year, he sort of gave us a sense that he was receptive to the idea. But of course, there are all these issues that need to be answered. Today, I mean, in the speech, he shied away from that issue altogether. But earlier, before he presented or tabled the budget, journalists did actually ask him about it. And this was his answer.
In this discourse, what is missing is how much that goes to supporting the poor people. For instance, the money that goes into municipalities every year to support the indigent, this financial year is 70 billion. Now, if we pick all of these pieces of support with a school nutrition or anything of that night, you put all of these things together, you come to a figure called 200 billion, close to 200 billion. Now you must ask the question, if somebody says to me, hey, get a basic income grant, I say, okay, fine, let me collect all of this and convert it into, I'm not saying I'm going to do it. But people discuss the basic income grant outside the entire package which we are providing to poor communities. So, but I'm more than open into a discussion which says this is the total package that is being provided to poor communities. Before we can start discussing, even if there's a need for a tax, is there an aggregation of this, of these benefits in the light of that? What needs to be reformed? What doesn't? in order to achieve whatever broad and noble objective.
Is it wrong?
Yes, it is.
Come on, Rachel, yeah? Tell us. Tell us why you think is wrong.
So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding on the minister's part on what is social assistance, for example. To allude to the fact that you're looking after municipalities, you're looking after hospitals and education is part of the support is shocking. Those are the bare minimum infrastructure that any functioning government needs to have. That's nothing anyone needs to clap for you for. And so when you say that the issue of basic income support grant should be taken in the context of all of this, no. As a functioning government, your hospitals, your schools, your municipalities must run. Then the issue of income support is different. You can't have, you've deliberately sunk the systems, they're not working. Now in an attempt to fix the lack of effective management, you now want to account that and say that it's helping the poor. No, it's not. You're clearly not understanding what social assistance is.
Is that why you were laughing when you said that?
So I want to come in as the lawyer first,
yeah.
Right? This country is meant to have a transformative constitution. And that transformation is a transformation from a bulk of the population that had nothing given to it, to making sure that the quality of life of every citizen is being improved. That's what the constitution demands of Minister Godongwana on a daily basis. So for him to come here and say, because I'm able to give indigent support to 1.5 million households, it doesn't matter than 10,000 households go to bed hungry in this country, it means there's a problem. Because he's right, he can show us the numbers. He can say, I'm spending 200 billion. But the question is, how many people are benefiting from that 200 billion? Can we actually go to bed and say, this constitution has succeeded if we continue to have the levels of food insecurity that we do? And also, at the end of the day, the lack of jobs, the levels of unemployment, the inequality in this country is something that the government was meant to solve. And so if he hasn't been able to resolve issues of unemployment, then unfortunately he'll sit with income support. And that's why his job is actually to move us from income support to full employment and contributing to the economy. And the Constitution demands that of him. And so for him to stand there and say, here are these numbers, doesn't make sense. The one thing that was angering for me from that earlier interview is that in that interview, he backtracks on what the president told us. The president told us in the SONA that actually it will be SRD into basic income grant. And in his interview, he's basically told us, forget basic income grant. Of course, he hasn't said it in parliament because it's the direct contradiction of what the president has said to us as a nation. And the question is, who's running this country?
In fact, Ayanda, I remember last year in the run-up to the ANC's policy conference, Lindy Wesisulu, who chairs the committee that looks into these types of issues, said that they'd taken a position as the governing party. They had even met Treasury to try and make them understand where they are coming from, and the decision was up to them now, to Treasury and the Minister of Finance and everyone else involved in putting together the budget that he tabled today, to actually then do the right thing, so to speak.
All right, thank you very much, Vuyo. I want to come from the heels of the two comrades. Number one, there's a constitution in this country, and ours is a constitutional democracy. Even if you are poor and you are unemployed, you still have a right to dignity that is enshrined in the constitution. You still have the right to life that is enshrined in the constitution. Now, the utterances of Minister Godongwana, I think it makes it, if I were to use a popular phrase, that makes him a constitutional delinquency, because he doesn't take into consideration to say, no ma uphangela usengumuntu, you've got a right to life. No ma uphangela usengumuntu, you've got a right to ube nesithunzi, ube nesidima. So if you're unemployed, you can't have dignity. If you're unemployed, it takes away your right to life. So the issue of basic income grant. It's an issue by the unemployed, by the cry of the excluded that says we want to assert our humanity, we want to assert our constitutional rights, because it doesn't help to have a constitution that guarantees you these rights, and in reality, that is the opposite. So I think the minister has got it wrong, is completely wrong. But two, those that are not employed, are unemployed, are not unemployed because they want to be unemployed, are not unemployed because they are lazy. They are unemployed because, again, the very same bosses, they make profits and they do not reinvest their money into the economy so as to create more employment or job opportunities. But number two, billions of money in this country goes into a black hole because of corruption. And it is this system that is rotten to the core that pushes the unemployed and the poor into the peripheries of society, into the margins of the society. So as the cry of the excluded, we are saying we want to have stake in the society. For the minister to say that is wrong, I think the minister has got it wrong himself.
I mean, you guys did some number crunching. Remember, right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was a resistance to the idea of a grant, to assist people who couldn't do that, do it for themselves. And you did some number crunching. And of course, you were part of this whole big movement that really pushed, the government. And when conversations, were ongoing, after that, around the basic income grant, you again sort of, I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are on the back of what the finance minister had to say on the basic income grant.
Yeah. I think there's 3 or 4 key sort of elements for us at least. The first, which reinforces what was said already, is that the finance minister's basically gone rogue. He is rhetorically and in the budget reneging on commitments made by the President of the Republic and by policy choices which the ANC has democratically made at its recent conference, right? And that's really important to understand. And it's not just rhetorically, because, and this is the second point, it's not just about the future of this basic income. It's actually about what's going on right now. And what we've seen is through National Treasury's unilateral actions around limiting budget in this sphere and therefore forcing DSD to apply highly exclusionary criteria, less people are receiving this grant now than there were a year ago. In February, March, and I'd like to just read these numbers. In February, March last year, there were 10.4 million people receiving the SRD. In January, it was 6.3. In February, March, 70% of applicants got approved. In January, it was 55. In February, March, 97% of approved applicants got paid. In January, it was 84. These numbers come from parliamentary presentations by DSD and SASA. These are not our numbers. So this is a complex sort of multifaceted reasons, but essentially the budget cap and stringent eligibility criteria have really undermined the distribution of this grant to people who desperately need it. Lastly, and this relates to what you were saying earlier, this is justified both by the fact that he's arguing, well, we give all these other sort of pools of money, but it's justified, in fact, by this, strong position that this is the most that's affordable. And the context here is 100 billion rand in revenue income, in tax income, higher than what was expected in last year's budget, right? And on tax, of course, if we had to increase taxes from where they are now to 80%, and we don't offer anything in return, okay, those who pay tax, that would be nonsensical and unfair, okay? But you can't separate the income and the expenditure side. If we are taxing and spending in a way which reduces crime, improves education, improves social cohesion, improves health, improves roads, improves load shedding, okay? Then those who live very nicely in Hyde Park, right, you know, might stomach that in a way in which we can't now. So we've got to view this income and expenditure thing together. And so those comments by the minister, to me, you know, both represent like arrogance by National Treasury, you know, show the manner in which they're destroying certain provisions and cloud that within the sort of envelope of, well, that's the most which we can possibly do.
Now, we've run out of time in the 4 minutes or so that we still have. I'm going to give all of you a minute each to say, you know, just as I was, asking, I was saying when I was asking Gilad the question, that it has taken a great deal of effort, work, fights, and all of that to, for instance, just on the SRD, you know, to get the government where it went, you know, and where we are right now. What do we do now to look at not only the issue of the basic income grant, but to answer the question we were posing, I posed at the beginning of this conversation? What do we need to? So what are the sort of things we still haven't done to then be able to get these conversations going to a point where everyone agrees to sit down and really confront this challenge head on? What have we not done still?
Look, I want to just start where Gilad ended. If you look at our higher education in this country, even people who stay in Houghton, in Hyde Park, take their kids to Wits, to University of Pretoria, to UCT. They don't, if they have a choice, take them to Bond or take them to any of the private universities. And that's because the higher education that is being provided in public universities in this country works. So similarly, the only way we get those with money to feel comfortable, and maybe actually let me just backtrack a bit from that. The problem that we've had with this government is that it's been pleading with the rich to give. It's failed to regulate. So even at the issue of food insecurity, they've done nothing to tell retailers, actually, this is not sustainable. You cannot increase prices at this and this and this point. So at the level of, you have a budget, yes, you can spend money, but you're also a regulator, you can regulate. I think that's what they haven't really been exercising, their regulating power in a way that actually can protect the poor. And then maybe we can understand why they're not spending those billions. We are here because they've allowed capital to run short over the poor completely.
Ayanda, what do we do? Please unmute.
I think what is important is that the poor and the unemployed must.
Okay, we have a problem with that line, and we have 1 minute only. Rachel, last word from you.
Yeah,
Sorry,
so I think
I'm saying if we do not wake up as the unemployed, as the poor, as the cry of the excluded, the big capital and the politicians will continue to push us to the peripheries of the margins or at the extensions of society.
Okay.
We must demand the basic income grant unapologetically. We must push back against privatization of SOEs. Over and above, we are calling on people of this country to say, as the cry of the excluded, will be embarking on mass action, will be embarking on protests. So it is quite important for people of this country to join us.
Yeah, 10 seconds, Rachel, is all I have.
Yeah, just for government to honor its constitutional commitments. And I think that's a good place to start, to coming to the table for these conversations.
That's how it comes to the end of the show. Let me thank all of you for coming on this evening. And that's our show for tonight. But do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.